Lights shattered, tempers flared. Fear spread like wildfire. Everyone thought Justin Baldoni was the problem, sabotaging his own film. But the truth was much darker. Ryan Reynolds wasn't part of the movie yet. He was always there, watching, smiling, controlling everything from the shadows. Every accident, every moment of chaos wasn't bad luck. It was part of a plan. The crew had no idea they were trapped in something far more sinister than a troubled production. They were feeding something, ancient and insatiable. It's time to meet Ryan's demon, greed. Being a production assistant on a big-budget film sounds glamorous until you live it. Long hours, endless errands, and zero sleep. You become a blur in the background, the person. No one notices unless something goes wrong. Coffee runs, moving equipment, coordinating last-minute changes, it's all part of the daily grind. Still, I was excited when I landed this job. This wasn't some low-budget indie flick. It was a high-profile drama, starring Blake Lively with Justin Baldoni directing. The kind of project that could open doors if I played my cards right. It had all the makings of a hit, a list actors, a respected director, and a massive budget. Yet from the very first day, something about it felt wrong. Blake wasn't like other actors I'd worked with. Most actors show up, hit their marks, and leave the creative decisions to the director. But Blake was different. She had control over almost every aspect of the production. She wasn't just delivering lines, she was rewriting them, and not just the dialogue. Entire scenes were being restructured at her command. Costume designs were altered without warning. Lighting setups changed on a whim, leaving the cinematographer scrambling to adapt. Justin didn't take it well. There were moments when I saw the frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He would push back, insisting that his vision needed to remain intact. But he didn't push too hard. Blake's influence was palpable. And it wasn't just because of her status as the lead actress. People whispered that she had connections at the studio, that Ryan Reynolds, her husband, was quietly pulling strings to ensure she had the final say. At first, I thought it was just the usual on-set drama. Creative clashes happen on every film. Directors and actors butt heads and compromises get made. It's part of the process. But the tension here felt different. It simmered quietly, like an undercurrent no one wanted to acknowledge. Then Ryan Reynolds showed up and everything shifted. Ryan wasn't part of the project. His name wasn't on the call sheets or in the production notes. But that didn't stop him from showing up regularly. He'd arrive unannounced, walking onto set like he belonged there. No one questioned it, not at first. I mean, it was Ryan Reynolds. He had that effortless charisma that made people gravitate toward him. Within minutes of his arrival, the mood would lighten. Crew members who had been stressed out and sleep-deprived suddenly found themselves laughing at his jokes. He had this way of making everyone feel seen, like they were in on the joke with him. At first, everyone loved having him around. It's hard not to like Ryan Reynolds. But then, I noticed something strange. Blake changed whenever he was on set. The warmth in her eyes vanished. She became distant, like she was holding her breath. I watched her closely. One day when Ryan walked onto set during a lighting test, her entire posture shifted, rigid, guarded. She barely looked at him, but I could tell she was aware of every move he made. It wasn't just Blake. The atmosphere on set grew heavier, like an invisible pressure pressing down on all of us. Arguments flared over minor things. Props being out of place, miscommunications about the schedule. Crew members who had worked together for years started snapping at each other. It was subtle at first, but it got worse the more frequently Ryan appeared. The first, truly bizarre incident happened during a pivotal scene. Blake had convinced Justin to reshoot it after days of back-and-forth arguments. I was nearby when their final standoff happened. Justin paced furiously in front of the monitors, shaking his head. "We've already got this scene in the can," he said. "There's no reason to reshoot." Blake crossed her arms. "It's not right. The tension isn't there. We need to redo it." Justin sighed deeply, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. I could see him weighing his options. If he pushed back any harder, he risked a full-blown confrontation. "Fine," he muttered. "Reset everything." The crew groaned, but got to work. Everyone was exhausted. We'd been shooting for 12 hours already, and tensions were high. As soon as the cameras rolled, disaster struck. An overhead spotlight exploded with a deafening crack, sending shards of glass raining down onto the set. People screamed and scattered. By some miracle, no one was hurt, but the sound was enough to leave everyone shaken. The production came to a standstill. The lighting crew rushed in to assess the damage, while the rest of us stood around in stunned silence. Justin muttered something under his breath, pacing back and forth. Blake, on the other hand, remained completely still. She didn't flinch when the light shattered. She didn't check on anyone or bark orders. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on the wreckage with an eerie calm. Ryan appeared minutes later, strolling in like he hadn't missed a thing. He took one look at the shattered glass and grinned. "Looks like the set's trying to kill you guys," he said, laughing. A few people chuckled nervously, but the tension didn't lift. Blake didn't move. She stood in the corner, her jaw clenched, her eyes distant. I didn't know what to make of it. Accidents happen on film sets all the time, especially when you're working with complex rigs and high-voltage lights. But the timing of this one felt off. Almost like someone or something wanted that scene ruined. Later that night, I overheard an argument between Blake and Justin. I had been running an errand near her trailer when their raised voices stopped me in my tracks. "We need to stick to the plan," Blake hissed, her tone sharp and urgent. "This isn't your film," Justin shot back. "You can't just rewrite everything to suit you and your—" He cut himself off abruptly, as if he'd said too much. There was a long pause, and I strained to hear more. "We don't have time for this," Blake finally said, her voice lower now, but no less intense. I held my breath, waiting for the argument to continue, but it didn't. Moments later, the door to the trailer swung open and Justin stormed out. He didn't notice me as he passed by, his face tight with barely contained rage. Blake followed shortly after. Her expression was cold, emotionless. When her eyes met mine, a chill ran down my spine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave me said it all. "You didn't hear anything?" I nodded quickly and walked away, pretending to be busy, but the words I'd overheard echoed in my mind. "Stick to the plan." What plan? And who was Justin referring to when he said "you're"? The questions gnawed at me for the rest of the night. I tried to push them aside, telling myself it was none of my business. But deep down, I knew something more than creative differences was at play. Over the next few weeks, the incidents kept piling up. Expensive equipment malfunctioned, without explanation. Props vanished without a trace. Crew members got injured. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to raise eyebrows. A grip twisted his ankle after tripping over cables that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Another crew member cut her hand on a piece of broken glass that no one could explain. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people whispered that Justin was sabotaging the production, trying to wrest control away from Blake. Others speculated that Blake was intentionally causing problems to assert her dominance. No one could agree on what was happening, but the tension on set grew unbearable. And through it all, Ryan kept appearing. He was always there at the perfect moment when tempers flared. When things went wrong, he'd stroll in, crack a few jokes, and somehow smooth things over. It was almost like he wanted the chaos to keep escalating, like he was feeding off of it. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that every time Ryan showed up, the air seemed to thicken, the pressure around us building until it felt like the whole production might collapse under its own weight. Something was coming, and whatever it was, it terrified me. Things reached a breaking point after a heated budget dispute. Tempers had been simmering for weeks, but that day, everything boiled over. The producers had been growing increasingly frustrated with the constant delays and mounting costs. Blake's insistence on reshooting scenes, often without consulting. Justin had thrown the schedule into disarray. The studio was bleeding money, and someone needed to take the blame. During a tense production meeting, one of the senior producers finally snapped. "We're tens of thousands over budget because of these damn reshoots," he said, his voice sharp and accusatory. He pointed toward Blake, who sat across from him at the conference table. "This is getting out of control. We're wasting time and resources on scenes that don't need to be redone." The room fell, silent. All eyes turned to Blake, waiting to see how she would respond. I expected her to argue or defend herself, maybe even lash out like some of the other stars I'd worked with. But she didn't. She just stared at him. It wasn't an angry stare. There was no emotion in her eyes at all. They were cold and distant, as if she were looking straight through him. The producer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his defiant posture wilting under her gaze. His face twitched, and for a moment, I saw something I didn't expect. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. "We're staying on schedule," Blake finally said, her voice low but commanding. The producer opened his mouth to argue, but quickly thought better of it. Without another word, he gathered his notes and left the room. The tension remained heavy and oppressive as Blake calmly stood and walked out without acknowledging anyone else. I watched her go, my mind racing. That look she'd given the producer, it wasn't normal. It was like she had power over him. Something beyond just her status as the star of the film. After that incident, I started noticing patterns. Every time Ryan appeared on set, something would go wrong. Arguments would break out over trivial matters, missing props, schedule changes, even catering mishaps. Crew members who had worked together for years began snapping at each other over nothing. And then there were the accidents. Equipment failures became routine. Lights flickered ominously during takes. A dolly camera veered off its track without warning, nearly crashing into a sound technician. At first, people blamed faulty gear or human error, but the incidents kept happening, always at the worst possible moments. Ryan seemed unaffected by the chaos. If anything, he seemed to thrive in it. He would show up with perfect timing, cracking jokes and offering solutions that temporarily calmed the tension. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put into words. One night, I found him, alone, near the prop table. The set was mostly deserted, and the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Ryan didn't see me at first. He was muttering to himself, his voice low and guttural. I couldn't understand the words, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. I stepped closer, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. He suddenly went silent and turned to face me. His expression shifted instantly, the unsettling intensity disappearing behind his trademark grin. "Late night, huh?" he said casually, as if nothing had happened. I nodded slowly, my throat dry. "Yeah, just wrapping up," I managed to say. Ryan chuckled softly. "You gotta love those long hours. It's where the magic happens." He gave me a wink before walking away, leaving me standing there in the eerie stillness. I didn't sleep well that night. The sound of his voice, those strange guttural whispers, echoed in my mind long after I left the set. Something was deeply wrong here, and Ryan Reynolds was at the center of it. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. After another exhausting night shoot filled with delays and accidents, I finally snapped. I followed Ryan Reynolds through the maze of equipment and soundstage shadows. The rest of the crew had gone home hours ago, leaving the massive set eerily quiet. Only faint echoes of my footsteps and the occasional metallic creak of scaffolding filled the space. Ryan walked ahead, calm and deliberate, as though he knew exactly where I was leading myself. I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, stepping closer. Why are you here? Why is everything falling apart around you? He stopped at last and turned slowly to face me. His eyes glinted under the flickering overhead lights, the warmth that usually softened his gaze completely gone. His grin, the one that could make entire rooms relax, was nowhere to be found. Instead, his face was cold, calculating. You've been curious, haven't you? He said softly. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was almost pleased. Good curiosity is the first step to understanding. I crossed my arms, trying to summon what little courage I had left. Cut the bullshit. I want answers. Ryan chuckled under his breath and shook his head, as if I'd asked a question with an answer too complex to fully grasp. Do you know where the word greed comes from? He asked, his voice conversational but laced with something deeper. I blinked, thrown by the abrupt shift. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, he replied. Greed isn't just a flaw. It's older than you can imagine. The word comes from griota, an ancient term for insatiable hunger. But that hunger wasn't just metaphorical, it was alive. And it had a name, Mammon. A shiver crawled down my spine at the sound of the name. There was something unnatural about it, like it echoed in a place deeper than my mind. Mammon. I repeated the word, foreign and heavy on my tongue. Ryan nodded, stepping closer. His presence seemed to grow larger, more oppressive, though the distance between us remained the same. Yes, the spirit of endless craving, he said. In medieval times, they called him one of the 7 princes of hell. He's not just some myth in dusty old books. He's everywhere, woven into the fabric of modern life. Corporations, social media, influencers, entire industries thrive on his power. People crave fame, wealth, validation. And now, through this movie, that power will spread even further. My head spun as I backed away a few steps. You're insane, I muttered, shaking my head. Ryan's grin returned, but it wasn't playful. It was predatory. He advanced another step, his voice dropping into a low, hypnotic hum. Am I? You've seen it yourself. The chaos, the greed, the fear. It's all part of the process. And I'm not just serving Mammon. He paused, locking eyes with me. I am Mammon. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a loose cable. No, you're Ryan Reynolds. This is some sick joke, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head slowly, the grin stretching wider across his face. Ryan Reynolds. He's just a face, a mask I wear. You have no idea how many masks I've worn over the centuries. People love me without even knowing why. They worship what I offer, the dream of more. And that dream, it's endless. They'll never stop chasing it. I tried to make sense of what he was saying, but the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in a way that made me sick. The accidents on set, the rising paranoia, the power Blake wielded. None of it was coincidence. Why do this? I managed to ask. Why manipulate people like this? His eyes darkened, his grin hardening into something colder. Because I'm greedy, he said simply. It's my nature. There is no enough for me. There never will be. I exist to consume, to spread desire. Every ticket sold, every fan who obsesses over this film, it all feeds me. My breath came in, short, ragged gasps. This was a ritual. The entire production was an offering, a carefully constructed trap. This movie, it's a trap, I whispered, the horror of it dawning on me fully. Ryan tilted his head slightly, regarding me with a mixture of amusement and condescension. A gift, he corrected. Millions will watch it. They'll obsess over it, buy into the brand, the merchandise, the lifestyle. And through that obsession, they'll fuel me. And you. He chuckled softly. You helped make it happen. A cold dread settled deep in my chest. Before I could speak, another figure stepped into the dim light. Blake, lively, She stood beside Ryan, her expression as blank and cold as marble. She glanced at me briefly but showed no emotion, as if I were already beneath notice. "It's time," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Ryan gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're both insane," I said, my voice trembling. Ryan waved dismissively. "Don't be dramatic. People think they're in control, but they're slaves to their desires. We just give them what they've always wanted. Fame, success, luxury," Blake added softly. Ryan gestured to her. "Exactly. This whole film was built to feed that endless hunger. They'll eat it up." "Why?" I gasped. "You already have everything." Ryan's eyes darkened. "There's no such thing as enough. That's the lie people tell themselves. They think there's a finish line, but there isn't. The race never ends." Blake crossed her arms, watching me like a sentinel. "You have a choice," Ryan said, tilting his head. "Forget all of this, or join us. Wealth, power, it's all yours." For a moment, I hesitated, the temptation clawing at me. But I remembered the fear and chaos on set, the control they wielded. "No," I whispered. Ryan sighed theatrically. "They always say no at first, but you'll come around." He stepped back, eyes glinting with amusement. "Suit yourself," he said. "Just remember, you helped make this happen. People don't need us to control them. They'll destroy themselves chasing their dreams, and I'll be there, offering more and more." Blake glanced at him. "It's time," she said quietly. Ryan nodded. "Enjoy the show." They disappeared into the shadows. I stood there, trembling, as silence closed in around me. The film premiered a month later. It was a global phenomenon, breaking box office records and captivating audiences around the world. Critics called it hypnotic, irresistible. Merchandise flew off the shelves and theaters overflowed with fans eager to watch it multiple times. Blake and Ryan were everywhere, on every screen, in every conversation, interviews, press tours, social media clips. Their faces and voices dominated every platform. The world was entranced by their story, their success. No one suspected the truth, but I knew. I knew the darkness that had fueled it all. And every time I saw their faces, I heard that whisper in the back of my mind. More. It was always there. The hunger they had fed, the trap they had set. Millions of people now carried that whisper with them too, unable to stop chasing the dream, the illusion that Mammon had promised through the film. The race without a finish line.